Parliamentary colleagues, those who work in the service of the House, those who work with members, those who are here as supporters of John Redwood, people from his constituency or more widely, whatever else motivates you to be here, thank you for coming. Some of you will have been present last month when Ken Clarke addressed us, and as you know, the theme for the first half of the year is Britain after Brexit, and in the best speakerly tradition, I'm keen to ensure that the different sides of the argument are fully articulated and debated. So Ken last month, John Redwood this month. I hope you will agree at the start and certainly at the end that this was, if I say so myself, a very sensible choice of visiting speaker. John is something of a polymath. He is by background an academic, a graduate, and indeed a doctoral graduate of the University of Oxford. He's a fellow of All Souls College. He also, of course, has a background as head of the Downing Street Policy Unit under Margaret Thatcher. He's worked for Robert Fleming and for Rothschilds as well, and beyond city interests has had a substantial corporate career out with the House, and many of you will remember that he served with considerable distinction in government, not least as Minister for Local Government. Bear in mind that old saying that local government finance is analogous to the Schleswig-Holstein question, namely that only 3 people ever understood local government finance, rather like the Schleswig-Holstein question. One of them died, the second went mad, and the third forgot what the answer to the question was. But John, presumably as Minister for Local Government, did understand these matters, and he went on to serve as Secretary of State for Wales in the major government. But more particularly, ladies and gentlemen, the point that I want to underline is that although John has been a man of government, he is first and foremost and quintessentially a parliamentarian. And there is one thing, well no, there are 2 things that I particularly as Speaker appreciate about his parliamentarism. One is that unlike some ex-ministers or shadow ministers who wander around looking almost bereaved that they no longer hold executive or shadow executive office, John has almost instinctively continued to immerse himself in the work and the life and the subject matter of Parliament because he's passionate about it. And that, of course, brings the great advantage that he confers upon the House all that experience that he acquired from his outside work and from his governmental service. The second thing that is greatly advantageous about John in the House is not altogether dissimilar to what I tend these days to say about his friend and colleague for New Forest West, Sir Desmond Swayne, namely that John either has been or should be thought to be the author of the textbook on pithy questions. If the speaker's pressed for time, it's always a good idea to call John because he'll ask a very brief question. He has extensive knowledge, and at the risk of embarrassing one of my good friends and colleagues in this place, I just want to conclude my introduction of John, who has this very, very widespread experience, by recalling to you this. A very dear friend of mine in the House said to me, I think 2 decades ago, "Quite frankly, John, you know, I really don't understand these economic issues. Indeed, they tend to make my eyes glaze over. But when I look at and listen to John Redwood, I say to myself, here is a person in complete command of his subject." Now, whatever side of the argument you are on Brexit, I think you will feel at the end of this evening that you have been addressed by and engaged with by someone who does know his subject, is passionate about it, and is as happy answering a question as he is making a speech. Please give a very warm welcome to the Member of Parliament for the last 30 years for Wokingham, John Redwood.
Mr. Speaker, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, John, for such a generous introduction. I now have the task of trying to live up to it. And I'm inspired by being in these magnificent state rooms from the Speaker's residence. Who could fail to be inspired by it and to want to speak of how our great parliamentary democracy will be resurgent and restored as we leave the European Union. On the 23rd of June 2016, 17.4 million voters instructed Parliament that we should leave the European Union. We Leave voters voted to take back control. We voted to take back control of our money, our laws, and our borders. We all together voted to be a sovereign people again. For the overarching aim of Brexit is to restore our freedoms. We wish to become self-governing as we wish to be. We want our parliaments to frame our laws, to levy and to spend our taxes, to make our borders safe, to award the precious gift of UK citizenship to those we choose to invite. We did not vote in the belief that future parliaments will always be wise, nor that they will always get it right. But we voted to restore powers to Parliament because it is our Parliament. We all, the British people, can lobby and influence it. We can dismiss and replace the MPs when they no longer please, and sometimes the public finds that a particularly pleasing thing to do. And I find it surprising that some still find it difficult to understand this overriding wish behind the Brexit vote. For if you know any history, it is based entirely on our long-standing pursuit of freedom as a people. It springs entirely from our history. For the history of the United Kingdom is the story of the long march of every man and every woman to the vote. The story of asserting the rule of law against all, however mighty. We prize the gift of freedom under the law for all on an equal basis. We share an aversion to slavery, a dislike of military rule, a resistance to arbitrary government, a rejection of the patronizing errors of elites, a distaste for overmighty bureaucracies cramping our freedoms, and we share a belief that we should all be free to do whatever we please unless the law prevents it. These are different traditions to those on the continent. For the signposts to our democracy run through Magna Carta to our first parliaments. They run from the 1660 settlement of the rights of the Crown to the Glorious Revolution, which limited them still further. They run from the Great Reform Act, bringing more people into the vote, to the triumph of the suffragettes, which we've been rightly celebrating recently. It's been one of the disappointments of my adult life that we have carelessly lost some of these freedoms. We foolishly cast away, I think, too much of our power, of our vote and our voice, by passing massive powers to the European Union. We allowed the European Union to impose laws we did not want. We allowed them to levy taxes we disagreed with. We allowed them to spend our money as they saw fit away from our shores. And Brexit is designed to recall those lost powers. It is a statement that the once free people will be free again. The once and future sovereign will be the people themselves. Let me begin by questioning the thoughtless assumption of some who think this should be an argument about trade and not about these wider truths. And let me engage with them on their own ground. Let me challenge their view that our membership of the single market and customs union has boosted our economy. They wish all of us to discuss in worried and hushed tones what we might lose commercially from leaving. Now, if you look out the economic growth figures for the United Kingdom since the war, you will discover that the UK economy grew faster from 1945 to 1972, when we joined the EEC, than in the long years since we joined. You will further discover that the growth rate did not accelerate in any way in 1992, when the EU claimed it had completed its single market. The immediate sequel to joining the EEC and to completing the single market was that the UK plunged into deep recession on both occasions. In 1974, it was the oil and banking crisis that affected much of the West. I don't blame the EEC for that, but the EEC offered us no respite or protection from it. In 1993, it was a recession created by European policy. Our period of shadowing the Deutschmark, and then as a member of the exchange rate mechanism, gave us a nasty short boom and a very unpleasant deep bust. So our earliest experience of the completed single market was a massive 5% loss in our national output and income. We were told then that creating currency stability was a crucial part of a single market. The only problem was that the EU-approved policy to achieve it did the very opposite. It created currency chaos and deep economic dislocation. I remember it only too well because I was a minister in a government that was putting through this evil policy, and I was in a small minority of dissidents within the government. Nicholas Ridley was extremely brave in the cabinet, and he and I talked a lot about it, and we were unable to persuade people that it would have the inevitable consequences it was going to have. And it echoed my experience in big business, because before I became a Member of Parliament, I'd been chairing a large industrial company. And it was quite early on that the CBI decided to adopt joining the exchange rate mechanism as their official policy. And I wrote a pamphlet in my personal capacity. I never associated company I was involved with my political views, unlike some people, but I wrote a pamphlet saying that I thought this would undoubtedly result in a bust and do enormous damage to business and the British people. And I contacted the CBI and said, please make your policy one of strict neutrality. You have members in your organisation, including me, who are deeply worried by this policy, who think it's against our interests. They were so committed to this folly that they would not give ground, and so I took my company out of the CBI and saved a very expensive membership fee, which was a delight to some of my colleagues, even if they didn't approve of the argument I was putting forward to save the money. But it taught me very early on the passions on the other side, the wish to be wrong. And the same thing happened again in government, that the government and the opposition were completely committed to this policy which was bound to come unstuck, and they failed to see it. The EU itself has sought to study the impact of the single market on the member states. They concluded that the UK got the least benefit of all the states out of the process. They said we experienced a single gain of just 1% over the whole time we've been in the single market, vanishingly small, under 0.1% a year. And I find it difficult to find something as good as that in the overall figures. There is no evidence in the figures of any gain. And if you showed people a graph of UK output and didn't give them any other guidance, they would not be able to point to the place on the graph where we joined the EEC or where we got the benefit of the single market. Instead, the UK's entry into the EEC's so-called common market of the 1970s speeded painful losses of industrial business in the United Kingdom. The lopsided freeing of trade that we were offered removed barriers in areas where France and Germany were strong, but did not do the same where we were strong in business. So it hastened large closures and output losses in steel, in cars, and other basic industry. In 1972, the UK made 1.92 million cars in the last year out of the EEC. 10 years later, in the EEC, that had fallen to a low of just 888,000, or under half the starting level a decade earlier. And during that fateful decade, we lost Austin and Morris, Wolseley and Riley, Vanden Plas and Hillman, Sunbeam and Triumph, Jensen, Rover, and many other great names of the UK motor industry. Now, I don't blame the EEC for all of that. It is true, there were homemade problems which pre-existed our membership. But no one can say we got a boost from EEC membership, and it's undoubtedly the case that the competitive force that was unleashed from tariff-free Germany and France speeded the process of decline, which may have begun somewhat earlier. In 1972, the UK steel industry employed 323,000 people, and the UK was the world's 5th largest producer. Today we have around 35,000 employees left and are in 21st place in the world. Our large coal industry that produced 147 million tonnes in 1970 has seen all the deep mines closed, and we have just a small residual as surface mining left. Meanwhile, the German steel and coal industries flourished, and the German car industry exported ever larger volumes to the UK, replacing our lost output. EU regulations have played a part in the demise of parts of our energy industries, and EU current energy policy is turning the UK into a substantial net importer, despite being a country rich with energy resources that other parts of the continent don't enjoy. In chemicals and textiles too, the UK lost out to continental competition. Under successive Labour and Conservative governments, there was a remorseless decline of important parts of our industry throughout the period of our membership. It is therefore difficult to see why people think there will be any additional loss of output when we leave the single market, when there was no gain from joining it, and a clear pattern of very sharp decline in several crucial areas. The argument of potential loss seems to be based on the dubious idea that our exports to the continent will suffer because we will find the EU impedes our access to this market. This assumption too needs a little examination. Given the way the rest of the EU exports to us much more than we export to them, and exports far more product that could attract tariff under WTO rules, imposing barriers could be a more costly choice for them. I assume the UK would retaliate should the rest of the EU impose tariff and non-tariff barriers, and that we would match any such restrictions. Tariffs will be strictly limited under World Trade rules, which bind both us and the EU, as we are both members. We should not exaggerate the impact moving to World Trade terms would have. Many countries have increased their exports to the EU at a faster rate from outside the customs union and single market, under WTO rules, than we have managed from inside the customs union. Non-tariff barriers, too, have to conform with the recently enforced Facilitation of Trade Agreement, which the WTO brought into timely effect last year and deals with many of the worries that some business people put to me about things that might go wrong when we leave the EU. It is, of course, possible the rest of the EU will want to punish us, but they will punish themselves more by imposing the limited barriers they could impose. And the UK economy would have several ways of adjusting, which means there would be gains as well as the obvious first-round loss. It could import cheaper goods from the rest of the world, removing tariffs on imports in return for free trade agreements with other countries. The UK could reimburse consumers and companies that had to pay the additional tariff by giving them offsetting tax cuts out of the substantial tariff revenue the UK state would collect. Although the Treasury is very reluctant about all of this, they would be the happy recipients of 16 billion in tariff revenue on EU exports to us if they continued at the same level, giving plenty of scope to compensate businesses and consumers. Meanwhile, the rest of the European Union would collect just 6 billion on our exports to them, and all of that money, of course, would go to the EU, not to the member states themselves, leaving France and Germany in some disadvantage. UK businesses could divert some production from export to the EU into the domestic market, and doubtless would. Our farms in particular would greatly expand production behind the substantial tariff wall that is allowed under WTO rules, because food is the exception to the rule that there are very few barriers and there are high tariffs on food, which would give considerable protection. And that would mean we could all enjoy more home-produced food as we used to before entry into the EEC. The one non-farm tariff that causes some to worry is the 10% tariff on cars, one of the few higher ones. Here you would expect the combined effect of the stronger euro, the euro has been strong against all currencies for the last year or two, and a 10% tariff to cause many more UK car buyers to switch to domestic suppliers. And that would help offset any impact on export volumes to the continent. The UK does run too high a balance of payments deficit, something I wish we would tackle more vigorously. It has been persistent for many years of our membership of the EU. It is heavily influenced both by the substantial budget contributions we have to make and by the large deficit in goods, which we have run consistently with the EU since the early days of membership. On our exit, we will be able to cut the deficit by no longer making payments. We will be able to rebuild our agricultural industry, and we will be able to ensure that we put those budget contributions to better work to support our own domestic concerns. Prosperity, not austerity, should be our aim. And prosperity will be easier won once we are out of the EU. Restoring the freedoms of a once sovereign people is the overriding task we face. And that mandate to take back control would enable us to do so. During the referendum campaign, I was asked one of the questions designed by Remain to damage the cause of freedom, and the question was, would you, media avidly asked, accept being poorer in order to regain lost freedoms? I replied that fortune meant there was no such choice before us. The very right to govern ourselves that we wish to reclaim will allow us to follow policies that make us richer, not poorer. As an optimist, I anticipate we will be better out than in, and will have the ability to do so. No one can be sure what loss there might be in store if we remained in the European Union. And no one can be sure how many gains we will seize out of the European Union. But what we do know is our fortune will rest more on our own decisions once we are free. So let me continue my account of life after Brexit by explaining how we can be better off. I appreciate this will be at variance with several modelled forecasts put out by an establishment afraid of freedom and scared of change. It is an establishment that has a proven track record of error in these matters. They told us the exchange rate mechanism would bring us a golden scenario of more growth and low inflation. Do you remember that one? Instead, it brought a deep recession. They told us if the UK stayed out of the euro, it would be deeply damaging to our businesses. Instead, our business flourished with the pound, and the euro area had several years of bad crises with low or no growth and some major recessions in the southern countries that left them with mass unemployment. They said the big build-up in debts prior to 2007 were fine because banks had found new ways of managing risk. That forecast didn't work out too well either. Now, I know my forecast will be criticised, for it is not backed up with a model nor expressed in precise figures. It does, however, come from someone who did forecast the ERM crisis, who did forecast the problems in the Eurozone, and with my party did forecast that the banks were overdoing it well before the crisis blew. I must warn that no one can deliver a precise and accurate 15-year economic forecast, and I have no intention of trying to deliver one tonight. Too many things will change. I can, however, point to the opportunities and the favourable changes that we can expect in the few years that follow Brexit that will boost whatever our growth rate then is, which will owe much to world circumstance. I do not expect a sudden fall in growth or income thanks to Brexit. The Treasury's short-term forecasts of such an outcome for the year after the vote have already proved wide of the mark, and their attempt now to delay them by a year or two, I think, will be no more successful. In future, as in the past, the main forces shaping our growth rate will be the pace of innovation, the money and fiscal policies being pursued, and the general state of the world economy. The most obvious gain that the anti-Brexit forecasters do not seem to put in their models is the chance to spend our tax money on our own priorities. The 12 billion we send every year to the EU and do not get back is lost money to the UK. Worse still, it is a large drag on our balance of payments every year. To pay that bill, we either have to borrow more money from abroad to pay the money to the EU, or we have to sell more of our assets to overseas buyers, cutting the investment income that we earn on those assets. Stopping that drag will immediately boost our economy and prevent further deterioration in our capital account. There's then the spending of the 12 billion a year at home, which will mean more jobs and more items bought from UK suppliers. That will boost our economy with extra growth of 0.6% of our total income. That's a 1/3 increase in the current growth rate in the year we first get to spend that money, with the same extra output in every year that follows, because you have the extra money every year. In the referendum campaign, I set out a draft budget to illustrate how we might spend the money, and I recommend it again to the government and would like to see it introduced as soon as possible. And I'm no great fan of offering the EU long payments after we've left. I advise that if the EU do not offer a wide-ranging and sensible free trade agreement anytime soon, we should discontinue all payments to the EU on March the 30th, 2019, and start the very obvious benefits to ourselves. There is no need for a transition or implementation period. If there is no good deal to transit to, we might as well just get on and do what we said we were going to do, which is to leave. We know we can trade well under WTO rules and with WTO tariffs, as that is what we do today with most countries outside the EU. And that is where we have a surplus on our trade account. Out of the EU, we will be free to fix and levy our own taxes. We were told by past governments that tax was a so-called red line issue. They promised us we would always be able to decide our own taxes. That proved to be untrue. Out of the EU, we can take VAT off feminine hygiene products, which we're not allowed to do today. We could remove VAT from green items, ranging from boiler controls to draft excluders. I've never met any MP who wanted those taxes, but we're not allowed to take them off today. We could promote fuel efficiency without the drag of extra VAT to keep us warm and to make people better off. We could do more to combat fuel poverty by cancelling the VAT on domestic heating. We could also levy the amount of tax we wish from larger companies. EU tax judgments on UK corporation tax levies have made us repay substantial sums of tax we thought had been fairly and legally levied under UK law, but we were trumped by European law. Once we leave the EU, we can take back control of our fishery. There have been many EU policies damaging to jobs and incomes for the UK, but none more consistently unhelpful than the common fishing policy. We have been changed from a country with a rich fishery and a strong net exporter of fish into a country with a badly damaged fishery, lamely importing our own fish from foreign interests that have taken it. A UK design policy can do better at conserving our stocks, whilst at the same time delivering more fish through UK boats to meet the needs of UK consumers. The long period of forcing discards of many dead fish at sea has pillaged our fishery in a bad cause. If a UK fishing policy requires fishermen to land everything they catch, we can catch less and eat more. A win-win for the industry, for the country, and for the fish. And that too will be a good boost for our economy. I'm glad there are a few fans of the fish out there. I like them dead and alive. I prefer the ones I eat to be dead, but I'm glad there are a lot that have a good free life out there in the seas. We have moved from 95% self-sufficiency in temperate products to under 70%. So out of the EU, we should restore the role of our farms as food producers. Our local supermarkets now are full of Danish bacon, Dutch salad stuffs, Dutch flowers and vegetables, Spanish fruit, French dairy products. And UK consumers have to pay higher prices than world prices for things we cannot grow for ourselves. For example, the tariff placed to make us buy Spanish oranges at a higher price than we would pay for South African ones. Common EU policies on beef and milk and much else have proved damaging to UK farmers. A UK-based policy can help farmers cut the food miles and gain a larger share of our domestic market. This too would boost our economy by growing one of our important industries, our farming and our wider food industry. Our membership of the EU confronted us in its early days with the abolition of tariff walls, which have protected some of our industry, whilst leaving up barriers against services where we had a competitive edge. Predictably, we slumped into a large and permanent deficit in our trade with the rest of the EU, and we lost all that industrial capacity I described earlier. German industry proved to be more competitive, and we turned to huge imports as we saw unemployment in our manufacturing heartlands mount. Out of the EU, we can manage our trade more effectively. Most people in the UK want us to promote more free trade, not introduce new barriers. This needs to be done fairly with reductions in barriers on both sides, and it will then help to boost our prosperity. Our trade with the rest of the world in surplus shows that we have an EU trade problem, not a global trade problem, and we do not have a general competitiveness problem. There can be some early and easy wins for trade policy as soon as the UK takes back control over this important matter. The UK can offer tariff-free access to our market to emerging market producers of tropical produce, probably in return for better access to aspects of their market. Old friends and trading partners like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, the USA will welcome free trade agreements with us. And the free trade agreements the EU has with third countries can novate to us as well as to the rest of the EU. I know of no country that has a trade agreement with the EU that wants to impose new barriers against the UK once we have left, and both we and the rest of the EU have to gain the consent to roll the existing arrangement over because both sides are different and are not party to the original agreement. Some say such arrangements may be possible, but will not offset the loss of our current trading arrangements with the rest of the EU. I disagree. It would be strange indeed if the EU in the end want to impose tariffs and other barriers on trading goods, given their huge surplus. But we will carry on exporting to them one way or another, and as I've attempted to show, I think overall there should be no loss. The only issue is how much gain we might achieve if policy went in the right direction. Today, the bulk of our trade is carried out under WTO rules with tariffs imposed by the EU. That is why I do not think we have to choose between being free and being rich. We do not need to stay in some Faustian pact, trading freedom for more exports, as some seem to think. The gloomier arguments that we will suffer from leaving are not merely misleading about the economy. They are also too narrowly concentrated on business profit and loss when we should be talking more of freedom and self-government. Leaving the EU will give us the freedom to decide who we should welcome into our country. Many people have voted for leave, and both government and opposition are keen that the UK should be open to talent, welcoming to entrepreneurs and investors, enthusiastic about extending academic networks through shared scholarship and exchange of scholars and students, and generous to those fleeing danger and intolerance. But many also feel we do need to impose some limits on unrestricted migration into low-paid jobs or onto benefits, because we want those who join us to enjoy good housing and decent living standards, and that requires us to expand our numbers at a sustainable pace. We also want a migration system which is fair between the EU and the rest of the world, not biased in the direction of Europe. Out of the EU, the UK will have more influence in the world. The UK has often been a force for good. We faced down genocides and warmongering dictators. We have often, with our US allies, stood for freedom, self-determination, and democracy. We stood up for those values of freedom and self-determination when we helped liberate Kuwait, freed the Falkland Islanders, and defeated the Axis powers in 1945. Some say if we leave the EU, we will become isolated and less powerful. That is selling us short and misunderstanding the realities. Out of the EU, the UK will regain her voice and vote in international bodies where the EU has displaced us. And we did not give up our seat during our time in the EU, though there were discussions about merging the seats that we hold on the Security Council of the United Nations. Let us take the WTO as an example of how we will have more influence out than in. We are an influential founding member. In recent years, we have had neither voice nor vote as the EU has spoken for us. Out of the EU, we will once again be a strong voice for free trade worldwide. Far from being isolated, we will have new allies and new stature. And the initial responses of the WTO to the UK's decision have been, I'm told, extremely positive, and they see Britain as a very benign force, and they want us to be free to make our own choices in these areas as soon as possible. Under WTO rules, the EU cannot impose on us any barriers they do not impose on all the other WTO members. So if some in the EU did have in mind retreating behind some stockade of tariffs and regulations, they will be picking a fight with the USA, China, and the rest, as well as us at the same time. Out of the EU, we will be able to regain our voice and our vote in various other bodies, like the standards-making bodies worldwide. Their work often requires the EU to implement their results, and so we will get a place at the high table instead of being takers of the meal at a more lowly establishment. For the main benefits of Brexit come from once again being a self-governing country. I find it extraordinary that so many who make their living out of government and politics are so defeatist about this greatest of countries. Why do they doubt our abilities to shape good laws, to frame a good economic policy, and trade with the 5 continents of the world based on what we are good at? Why do they both say they love the EU, yet have such a low view of it that they think its main aim will be to do us down? Why do they tell us that every clause and line of the treaties has to be enforced against the UK, yet all those great clauses in the treaties that require the EU to be a good neighbour and free trading partner in nearby states will, in their view, go unenforced and unheeded? If the EU is as logical and legal as they say, our future-friendly relationship is entirely assured. And if it should prove not to be the case, that it is so legally driven and logical, and that the treaty is made for breaking, it need not concern us what it says, especially once we are out. Anyone who walks the corridors and great rooms at Westminster must see here the heroic story of our islands. There on the walls and in the sculptures are the establishment figures and the rebels, the winners and the losers, the great moments of our history. There is the signing of Magna Carta, here the taming of the king in the 17th century, there the union of the crowns, the saving of Europe from Napoleon, the passage of the Great Reform Bill, and the triumph of the suffragettes. So many who made common cause to put the people in charge through their vote, and to put Parliament in charge of carrying out the people's wishes. All the time we remained in the EU, there were an increasing number of laws we could not change, more taxes we could not control, more money that someone else spent. The system took away the very freedoms our ancestors fought for and established. Once back, these powers will be used well, sometimes badly, but always as a result of strong argument and heated votes here at home. We will doubtless have economic reversals out of the EU, as we certainly did when we were in it. But this difference matters. Next time when the mistakes are made, they will be our mistakes. They will be mistakes the British people can punish and put right. More importantly, taking back control gives us immediate opportunities to legislate wisely, to grow our prosperity. That is why I voted for Brexit. That is why many of the 17.4 million people voted for Brexit. And that is why many who voted Remain will be winners too from this great cause. Once we are at last out of the EU, this great people this once and future sovereign people will have many contributions to make to the world, as we have in the past. So let us be a voice for freedom, a strong arm for peace, and a force for good around the globe.